Welcome, sleepy summoner. Rest your weary mind. Let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders like shadow retreating from firelight. The Grand General, a tale of Swain. Tonight, we travel not to distant lands or strange shores. We venture instead into the heart of an empire where fire burns eternal, where stone remembers ancient sorrows, and where the whispers of darkness speak truths that mortal throats dare not voice aloud. We enter Noxus, that sprawling kingdom of strength and sacrifice, of ambition tempered by ruthless pragmatism. But this is not a tale of conquest or glory sung loudly in grand halls. Rather, we walk through history quietly, as one might walk through a sleeping fortress where sentries slumber at their posts and only the wind carries sound. We trace the footsteps of a man called Swain, and we follow them backward through time, watching as certainties crumble and becomes uncertain, as power emerges from the ashes of defeat, and as one soul learns to dance with darkness itself. Let your breathing slow. Feel the cool night air upon your face, though we are nowhere near it. Imagine the distant glow of Noxus burning softly on some far horizon, illuminating nothing, comforting nothing, yet burning always. The ravens gather, patient and silent. They have much to tell, and we have all the night to listen. Close your eyes now if you wish, and let us begin. There is no urgency here. Time moves differently in memory, differently in places that no longer exist as they once did. A man once walked these stones who would reshape an empire, and his footsteps echo still, fading into that vast darkness where all things eventually rest. Come, the story awaits, and it asks nothing of you but your attention. Part 1. The inheritance of noble blood. In the great fortress known as the Immortal Bastion, there stood a young man who believed entirely in the rightness of his nation. This was not arrogance, though arrogance lived in Noxus as naturally as water lives in the sea. Rather, it was the conviction born of a privileged childhood, of learning from earliest memory that Noxus stood supreme among all the world's powers, that its people possessed something other nations lacked, that strength was not merely valued, but sacred. Swain was born into one of those proud patrician families that had existed since the first walls were raised around Noxus, since those desperate exiles called the Noxi had seized the Immortal Bastion and made it their own. His family had played a role in that founding, or so the old stories claimed. Every noble house tells itself stories of its own importance, of moments when its ancestors stood at the heart of great events, when their decisions shaped the destinies of nations. The Swain family was no different in this regard. The Immortal Bastion itself seemed designed to instill such beliefs. It rose from the earth like a fortress born from stone itself, its walls thick enough to withstand any siege that history had yet devised, its towers reaching toward a sky that had never been conquered. The architecture within spoke of strength and endurance. Every corridor, every chamber, every courtyard seemed built with the intention that it would outlast empires. Surely a young mind might think, only the greatest people could dwell in such a place. Surely only the worthy could claim it as home. Jericho spent his youth in these halls, learning the languages of Noxus and the nations beyond it. He studied the history of the empire, though he understood little of what history truly is, how it bends and shifts depending on who tells it. He learned swordsmanship, as all noble sons did, and horsemanship, and the games of court that older men played for wealth and influence. But it was in the halls of strategy and discourse that he truly found himself. He possessed a quality that cannot be taught, though it can certainly be cultivated. He could see the shape of things, not in the mystical sense, not through any demonic power or supernatural gift, but in the way that a skilled player of strategy games understands the board before making his move. In those years, Noxus was ruled by a man named Borum Darkwill, an emperor who had proven his strength through war and through cunning, who had shaped the empire through the sheer force of his will. Darkwill had been chosen by the great noble houses to rise above them, to represent their collective might in one singular ruler. This arrangement, like all power structures, carried within it the seeds of its own corruption. To be chosen to rule in a society that valued strength above all else meant that one must continually prove one's strength. And as time passes, as bodies grow older and minds grow weary, the ways a ruler chooses to prove strength often become more desperate. Young Jericho did not yet understand this. He only knew that Borum Darkwill was the living embodiment of Noxian might, that the Emperor ruled from the immortal bastion as a father might rule a household, with absolute authority balanced by absolute responsibility. This was the narrative that the noble houses had constructed, and it was the narrative that Jericho had been taught to believe. But beliefs can be fragile things, maintained only through continuous reinforcement and isolation from contrary evidence. The young man's education was about to receive a disruption. Among the countless plots that churned beneath the surface of Noxian politics like currents beneath dark water, one had begun to move toward fulfillment. Many of the great noble families concerned about the direction the empire was taking, concerned about Darkwill's increasingly erratic decisions, had begun to whisper about the possibility of his removal. They did not speak of this openly, of course. Such things are never spoken of openly, not in Noxus, not where strength is God and the strongest rule. Instead, they spoke in shadows and secret chambers. They began to weave plans intricate and carefully crafted, plans that might have never come to fruition but for the intervention of others. There existed within Noxus an organization that operated in the shadows so deep that most people did not even know it existed. This was the Black Rose, a cabal far older than the Empire itself, dedicated to the accumulation of power, secrets, and influence. It had existed for more than 1,000 years, movers like a dark current through the history of nations, shaping events from positions hidden so thoroughly that few could ever prove they had been shaped at all. The Black Rose served no nation. Instead, nations served it, unknowingly. At the head of this organization stood a woman known only as the Pale One, the matron of the Black Rose LeBlanc. Her true age was unknown. Her true origins were unknown. Her true appearance, many believed, was unknown even to herself. She was a master of illusion and deception, not merely in the magical sense, though she was certainly that as well. She understood the illusions that people create for themselves, the stories they tell themselves to justify their actions, the lies they live within day after day. And she knew how to manipulate these illusions with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. LeBlanc had watched Borum Darkwill's rise to power. She had watched as he had consolidated the strength of Noxus, as he had bent it to his will, as he had begun to show signs of the paranoia that so often comes to those who hold absolute power. She had seen in him potential for her purposes as a tool to be wielded, and so she had begun, in her subtle way, to whisper in the ears of those who might listen. She had encouraged the plots against Darkwill, not because she wished him overthrown, but because she wished to create chaos. In chaos, she could move more freely. In the confusion of civil strife, the Black Rose could consolidate its own power while others fought amongst themselves. It was into this murky web of intrigue that Jericho Swain was suddenly drawn, though he did not understand at first what was happening. The young nobleman had made a reputation for himself through intelligence, through a keen mind that could grasp military strategy and political maneuvering with equal ease. Darkwill had noticed this. More importantly, certain councillors close to Darkwill had noticed it, and they had begun to rely upon the young man's judgment in matters of security and strategy. It was a dangerous position. Every councillor close to a tyrant walks a razor's edge, knowing that they might be of great value one moment and an impediment to be removed the next. It was through these connections that Jericho was approached with information regarding a conspiracy. Those who approached him claimed to be loyal servants of Noxus, concerned about threats to the Empire's stability. They presented him with evidence carefully curated and arranged, which suggested that many nobles, including some from his own family, were plotting against Darkwill. They urged him to act. They emphasized that only he had the position and the credibility to investigate these claims thoroughly. They stressed that the future of Noxus itself hung in the balance. What they did not tell him was that these same pieces of evidence had been carefully arranged by agents of the Black Rose, that the conspiracies they described were both real and deliberately permitted to continue, that his actions, whatever they might be, would serve LeBlanc's purposes. Jericho Swain was, at his core, a young man who loved his nation. This is important to understand. He was not a mercenary or a sellsword, or a man motivated primarily by personal ambition. He was a patriot, in the way that young people in powerful positions often are, before they have learned to question what patriotism truly means. When told that the empire he loved faced a threat from within, he did not pause to consider whether the information might be suspect. He did not consider that he might be a pawn in a game far larger and more complex than he could yet perceive. Instead, he acted. The investigations that followed were thorough and merciless. Young as he was, Swain possessed a clarity of purpose and a logical mind that cut through the confusion of political intrigue. He identified those involved in plots against Darkwill with remarkable accuracy. He traced the web of conspiracies, following thread after thread to their origins, and he did what he believed had to be done. He executed those he found to be traitors to the Empire. This included members of the Black Rose itself. It included, most painfully, members of his own family, his own blood relatives, who had been caught up in the conspiracies he was unraveling. There are certain moments in a young person's life that define them forever after. Moments when they make choices that cannot be unmade, that alter the course of their entire existence. For Jericho Swain, this was such a moment. A lesser man might have wavered. A lesser man might have allowed his love for his family to interfere with what he believed to be his duty to his nation. But Jericho Swain had been raised in Noxus, where strength meant the ability to make hard choices, where patriotism meant placing the empire above personal preference, above family bonds, above the claims of blood. He made his choice, and he lived with it. And in making that choice, he aligned himself more closely with the ideals of Noxus than he ever had before. Darkwill rewarded him for his service. The young man was granted a commission in the Noxian military, given command of soldiers, given the opportunity to prove his worth on the battlefield. It seemed that his future was assured. He had proven his loyalty. He had demonstrated his capability. He had shown that he possessed both the intelligence and the will to do what needed to be done. But there were whispers in the immortal bastion, whispers that only certain people heard. Among those who whispered was LeBlanc herself, watching her pieces move across a board of her own design. She whispered that the young General Swain, for all his loyalty, possessed something that was perhaps more dangerous than mere conspiracy. He possessed the capacity to think independently, to question, to observe and draw his own conclusions. She whispered that such people are always the most dangerous in the end, and she noted with satisfaction that while Swain had executed many of her agents, he had failed to execute her. That failure had been deliberate, of course. The Black Rose had sacrificed some of its lesser pieces, understanding that by doing so, they would blind young Swain to the true nature of the organization he was fighting. They would leave him believing that he had defeated them, when in fact they had only retreated further into shadow. But none of this occupied Jericho Swain's mind as he took command of his first war host. He was a general now, or nearly so, and he had ambitions befitting a man of his station. He studied the strategies of the great generals of Noxus's past. He learned to lead men in battle, to position troops, to anticipate the movements of his enemies. And when Noxus looked for places to expand its influence, when the Empire's restless appetite for conquest began to turn outward, it was to a general named Jericho Swain that command of those expeditions fell. It would be in these wars, far from the halls of the immortal bastion, that his education would truly begin. Part 2. The consolidation of strength command of a war host in service to Noxus was not a position one held for very long without proving oneself worthy of it. The Empire was built on strength, and strength was proven through victory. The soldiers under Swain's command cared nothing for his noble blood or his access to the halls of power. They cared only for whether he could lead them to victory, whether he could keep them alive, whether his strategies were sound. This suited Jericho Swain perfectly. He had spent his youth navigating the treacherous waters of Noxian politics, learning to read the subtle signs of conspiracy and hidden motive. He found the clarity of military command almost restful by comparison. On the battlefield, the lines were clear. The enemy was external, not hidden in the faces of those who stood beside you. Victory was measurable and objective. The men who served under him either lived or died, and if they lived, it was because his strategy had been sound. Under his command, the Noxian military achieved a series of remarkable victories. He expanded the Empire's influence into new territories, establishing the military outposts known as Noxtora in strategic locations, fortifying Noxian control over conquered lands. These were not merely destructive campaigns driven by the blind appetite for conquest. Swain brought to his military operations something that was less common in the Noxian military of his time: a clear, strategic vision. He did not simply conquer and move on. He consolidated. He ensured that conquered peoples, or at least the strongest among them, could see the benefit of Noxian rule. He demonstrated that the empire was stronger than any resistance could be, but he also demonstrated that those who pledged themselves to Noxus would be treated according to their merit and their strength. In a nation built on the worship of strength, this was a pragmatic approach that allowed for stable expansion. And yet, even as he succeeded in these external campaigns, his mind was beginning to turn inward, back toward the immortal bastion and the nature of power itself. During these years, Noxus had been engaged in various military campaigns across the known world. The Empire's reach extended further and further, but there was a hunger at the heart of Darkwill's reign that seemed never to be satisfied. The Emperor had begun to become obsessed with matters of immortality, with legends of artifacts and relics that might extend a ruler's lifespan indefinitely. He sent out entire war bands not to conquer territory or gather resources, but to search for objects of mystical power, for magical weapons and enchanted artifacts that might grant him extended life. This was a dangerous shift in priorities. With the military stretched thin, chasing whispered rumors and legendary artifacts across multiple continents, the wars became harder to win, the campaigns more costly in terms of lives and resources. Young General Swain, commanding forces in these campaigns, began to perceive something troubling in his orders. The objectives of his campaigns seemed less tied to genuine strategic interests and more tied to the personal obsessions of an aging emperor. And he began to think, as intelligent men do when they perceive that something is wrong, about what might be causing this situation. He had been educated by the best teachers Noxus could offer. He had studied history and strategy, politics, and the nature of power. He began to recall, with the clarity of hindsight, certain events from his youth. He began to remember details of the conspiracies he had uncovered, details that took on new meaning in light of his present understanding. There was one crucial detail in particular that he had begun to remember. In his investigations as a young man, he had uncovered evidence of the Black Rose, that ancient organization that moved in shadows. He had believed that he had destroyed that organization's presence in Noxus, or at least crippled it significantly. He had executed many agents, and yet he had somehow failed to execute one person. A pale woman, the leader of the Black Rose, had been reported killed, but had somehow escaped the net of his justice. At the time, this had seemed like a failure, a single imperfection in an otherwise thorough investigation. But now, years later, as he observed the increasingly erratic behavior of his emperor, as he watched Darkwill become more and more obsessed with impossible dreams of immortality, it began to occur to him that perhaps this had not been a failure at all. Perhaps it had been deliberate. Perhaps she had let him find and kill the lesser members of her organization, the ones whose loss would not damage the Black Rose's true work. Perhaps she had let him believe that he had defeated her, when in fact she had only retreated further into shadow, from a position where she could continue to work her will upon the Empire. This was a troubling thought, the kind of thought that could not be unthooched. Once it had been thought. It began to grow in Jericho's mind like a cancer, shaping his perceptions, making him see patterns where there might have been none. But there is truth in the idea that if one knows what to look for, one will find it. And Swain had learned long ago how to look for the signs of conspiracy. It was during this period of internal questioning and growing suspicion that Noxus made a decision that would alter the course of Jericho Swain's life forever. The empire had been expanding for years, growing more powerful, annexing new territories and peoples under the banner of Noxian strength. But there was one land that had always resisted, one place where Noxian power had never truly taken root. That place was Ionia, a land of mystical beauty and spiritual strength, a place where the people did not bow easily to foreign rule, where the culture was so deeply rooted in the land itself that it could not be simply erased or subsumed. Darkwill, driven by his obsessions and his hunger for the legendary artifacts that were rumored to exist in various lands, decided that Ionia would be conquered. He began the invasion with great confidence, sending massive forces across the sea, committing the full might of the Noxian military to the conquest of this distant land. And he called upon General Jericho Swain to lead the campaign. It seemed an honor, a mark of how much confidence the Emperor placed in him. But to those with eyes to see, to those who could read the subtle currents of politics within the immortal bastion, it seemed something else. It seemed like an opportunity for powerful figures to remove a potential threat from the center of power. It seemed like a way to test a young general's loyalty by placing him in an impossible situation. Swain was at that time still young enough to accept the assignment without fully questioning the strategic wisdom of it. He gathered his forces, he made his preparations, and he sailed toward Ionia with the confidence of a general who had never yet faced defeat. He believed that Noxian strength, Noxian discipline, and Noxian will would be enough to overcome any resistance. He was wrong. Ionia was not like the other lands that Noxus had conquered. There was a magic to it, a connection between the people and the very land they inhabited that made conquest nearly impossible. When Noxian soldiers marched through Ionian forests, the forests seemed to rise up against them. When they tried to establish strongholds, the very stones resisted their efforts, and the Ionian people, rather than breaking under the weight of conquest, seemed to grow stronger, more unified, more determined in their resistance. Swain found himself in a position that no general truly wants to face. His forces were stretched thin. He was being asked to hold territory against an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources and infinite determination. And back in Noxus, the support that should have been reaching him, the supplies and reinforcements that were necessary to continue the campaign, seemed to be drying up. This was no accident. This was deliberate. The messages being sent back to the Immortal Bastion suggested that the campaign was going poorly, that General Swain was failing in his appointed task. These messages, carefully crafted by agents of the Black Rose, turned the Emperor's mind against his general. The supplies that should have come never arrived. The reinforcements that were promised never materialized. It was during the later stages of the Ionian campaign that Swain found himself in command of a force that was, for all practical purposes, cut off and unsupported. He was trying to hold a position of strategic importance, a place called the Placidium, against overwhelming odds. He attempted to lure the Ionian forces into a trap, believing that if he could achieve a major victory, if he could defeat a significant portion of the Ionian army, then the political situation back in Noxus would shift in his favor. Perhaps the supplies would resume. Perhaps the reinforcements would arrive. Perhaps his honor and his success would speak louder than the whispered accusations of failure. But the trap did not work as planned. In the chaos of battle, amid the clash of Noxian blades and Ionian weapons, a young girl rose up against his forces. Her name was Irelia, and she wielded an ancient blade with a skill that seemed impossible for one so young. She had been held as a hostage in the Placidium, but she had broken free, and her liberation had sparked a general uprising among the captured Ionians. In the confusion of the battle, the careful arrangement of Swain's trap fell apart. The Noxian forces were routed. The general, fighting on the front lines as any good Noxian commander would do, found himself cut off from his army, surrounded by enemies, facing overwhelming odds. It was in those moments that the decisive blow fell. Irelia, the girl warrior of Ionia, cut off Swain's left arm. The blow was precise and devastating, delivered with the full strength of her ancient blade and the will of a people fighting for their freedom. The general, wounded beyond immediate recovery, fell bleeding upon the stones of the Placidium, his arm lost, his forces destroyed, his campaign in ruins. He lay there dying. The pain was tremendous, but it was the pain of the body, not the soul. Worse than the pain was the clarity of his situation. He understood, in those final moments as consciousness began to drift away, that he had been betrayed, not by his soldiers, not by the Ionians, but by his own nation, by the emperor who had sent him to an unwinnable war, by the people in the immortal bastion who had deliberately cut off his support. He had served Noxus faithfully. He had placed the empire above his own family, above his own happiness, above his own dreams, and Noxus had repaid him with abandonment, leaving him to die on a foreign shore. As the light began to fade from his vision, as the sounds of battle became distant and indistinct, something changed. A raven came down, black-winged and sharp-eyed, approaching the dying general. In his final moments, as consciousness flickered, Swain looked into the bird's eyes, and he saw something that could not be explained by any natural cause. In the raven's eyes, he saw visions. He saw the immortal bastion, that great fortress where he had spent his youth. But now he saw it differently. He saw the shadows within it, the hidden places where ancient power dwelt. He saw the pale woman, the one called LeBlanc, weaving her webs of deception. He saw the emperor, Borum Darkwill, puppet and tyrant in equal measure, dancing to rhythms set by hands that moved in shadow. And he saw something more, deeper than the conspiracies of men, older than the empire itself. There was something ancient and terrible at the heart of the immortal bastion, something that fed upon secrets and whispers, something that had existed long before Noxus rose from the rubble of older civilizations. This was no vision granted by mortal magic. This was something else entirely, something that came from a source beyond his understanding. In that moment between life and death, as his blood ran out upon the stones of Ionia and his consciousness began to fade, Swain became aware of something ancient and hungry that had been watching him, waiting for this moment. The darkness pressed in around him. The hunger of the ancient thing reached out towards him, intending to consume what remained of his consciousness, his will, his very self. And something in Jericho Swain refused to accept this. Even as his body lay dying, even as his arm was severed and lost, Something within him rose up and fought against the consuming darkness. He would not let it take him. He could not. In that final moment of clarity, his will crystallized into something hard and immovable. He grasped at the edges of the consciousness offered by the darkness, and instead of allowing himself to be consumed, he began to understand. He began to see not just visions but truths. The truth of Noxus, the truth of the Black Rose, the truth of the power that dwelt beneath the immortal bastion. And most importantly, he saw something that the ancient thing that reached toward him had not expected. He saw that there was a way perhaps to wield this power, not to be consumed by it, but to command it, not to let it take control of him, but to bend it to his own will. It was a glimpse, only the briefest of glimpses, before darkness finally took him. Part 3. The Cripple and the Shadow. When General Jericho Swain regained consciousness, he found himself back in Noxus. The details of how he had been transported from Ionia to the Immortal Bastion were unclear. What was clear was that he was alive, though by the time he woke, the world had moved on without him. The Ionian campaign was over. It had been called off, the forces withdrawn, the conquered territories abandoned. The official word from the Immortal Bastion was that the campaign had proven too costly, that the strategic benefits did not justify the expenditure of resources and lives. But in the streets and halls of Noxus, there was a different story being told. In those places where people gathered to speak openly, the word was that General Swain had failed, that his incompetence had led to the destruction of a massive Noxian force, that he had lost an arm in combat and had been cast into ignominy as a result. He was discharged from the military, deemed unfit for service. A general who had lost an arm could not lead troops effectively, could not serve as an inspiration to those under his command. The official reason was practical and unsentimental, as was the Noxian way, but the true meaning was clear to those who understood the subtleties of power. He was being cast out. He was being discarded. He was also being quietly watched, Swain came to understand, by those who had orchestrated his fall. After his discharge, as he attempted to navigate the city of Noxus as a crippled invalid, he found that he had few allies. Those who had served under him in the past seemed suddenly unwilling to make eye contact. Those who had been his social equals now treated him with polite distance, as if disability might be contagious. The Immortal Bastion, which had been his home since childhood, now felt like a foreign and hostile place. He rented a small residence outside the main fortress, a place where he could withdraw from the society that had rejected him. And there, in those long days and nights of isolation, the revelation that had come to him at the moment of his apparent death began to take on new meaning. The visions had been real. He understood this now with absolute certainty. They had not been hallucinations brought on by blood loss or the proximity to death. They had been something else, something that had reached across the boundary between the living and the dead to touch his consciousness. And they had shown him something true about Noxus and about the ancient power that lay at its heart. He began to obsess over finding that power. This was not a rational obsession, or rather, it was rational in its own way, driven by a logic all its own. He had nothing left. His position, his honor, his place in society had all been taken from him. His career was over. His family, what remained of it after his youthful purges, would not look upon him with favor. He had nothing left to lose, but he had, he believed, glimpsed the location of something vast. He had seen it in those visions at the moment when the ancient consciousness had reached toward him. It dwelt beneath the immortal bastion, in places that most people did not even know existed. It was old, so very old, perhaps older than Noxus itself, and it possessed power that could reshape the world. If he could find it, if he could touch it, if he could do what no other person had ever succeeded in doing, what even the great LeBlanc, for all her cunning and her centuries of existence, had never achieved, if he could wield that power. This became his obsession. This became his entire world, especially in those first dark months of exile from the halls of power. He began, slowly and carefully, to explore the depths beneath the immortal bastion. He learned the hidden ways that ancient servants had known, the secret passages that connected different levels of the fortress. He studied the history of Noxus, reading every account he could find about its founding in its earliest days, and he began to understand that Noxus was built upon something that had come before. The immortal bastion was not the first fortress built on this location. Before Noxus, before the Noxi came and seized power, there had been another civilization, and that civilization had left behind more than just stones and ruins. They had left behind something alive, or perhaps not alive in the traditional sense, but it possessed consciousness, or something that functioned like consciousness. It dwelled in the darkness beneath the fortress, and it fed upon the secrets and whispers of the living world above it. It preyed upon the dying, drawing to itself the last moments of consciousness, the final thoughts and secrets that people carried with them as they passed from life into death. This was Realm, though Swain did not yet know that name. This was the demon of secrets, the ancient entity that the Black Rose had been seeking for centuries. This was the source of LeBlanc's extended life, the reason she had survived for more than 1,000 years while ordinary mortals aged and died. Not directly, perhaps, not through any obvious pact, but through her ability to harvest the secrets that Realm gathered, to feed upon the knowledge and power that the demon accumulated. And this was what Swain had glimpsed when the raven's eyes had opened his vision. His search took years. This was not something that could be rushed. The ancient thing beneath the immortal bastion was guarded by more than just physical barriers and locked doors. It was protected by the weight of centuries, by the accumulated defenses of countless generations who had sought to contain its power. Many of those defenses were not magical in nature, though some were. Many were simply practical, sealed passages, hidden entrances, and above all, the deep secrecy maintained by those few who knew of the entity's existence. During these years of searching, Swain was forced to support himself somehow. His family wealth had been diminished by his father's execution for treason, or what had been ruled as treason, though Swain himself had ordered that execution. He had some pension as a discharged military officer, enough to live modestly, but not enough to live in the style to which he had once been accustomed. He found work where he could, using the skills he possessed. He hired himself out as a military consultant to various Noxian commanders, advising them on strategy, even though he could no longer lead troops in person. He used what remained of his connections to gain access to the immortal bastion, carefully and cautiously, always making sure that his visits seemed unremarkable and unmotivated. by anything more than simple nostalgia or a cripple's need to remember his glory days, and he watched. He observed the patterns of power in Noxus. He noted who visited the deeper levels of the immortal bastion. He marked which officials seemed to have knowledge of something hidden, something ancient and terrible. He began, slowly, to map out the connections between the Black Rose and the highest levels of Noxian government. What he discovered was that the rot ran deeper than he had initially believed. The Black Rose was not some separate organization operating at odds with the government of Noxus. Rather, it was woven throughout the government, its members occupying positions of significant power and influence. Many of the nobles who served as advisors to the emperor were, Swain came to understand, agents of the Black Rose. They shaped policy, they guided decisions, they steered the empire according to a plan that had been centuries in the making. And at the center of this web sat LeBlanc, the pale woman, the matron of the Black Rose. She had survived the purges that young Jericho Swain had carried out. She had orchestrated his fall from grace. She had positioned agents and allies throughout the empire, ensuring that when the time came, she would be able to maintain her control regardless of what happened to any individual ruler or general. But there was something else as well. Something that disturbed Swain even more deeply than the simple fact of the Black Rose's power. There was a connection between LeBlanc and the ancient entity beneath the immortal bastion. The demon did not serve her, not in any traditional sense. But there was a pact, an understanding of some kind, a bargain struck long ago that had allowed the Black Rose to survive and flourish, while other organizations had fallen to dust. This was the real source of Noxian power. Swain began to understand, not the strength of its soldiers, though that was formidable, not the will of its rulers, though strong rulers were necessary. The real source of Noxian power was this ancient entity, this thing that fed upon secrets and consciousness. It was the soul of the empire, twisted and dark, rooted in violence and blood, and the sacrifice of innumerable lives. Understanding this changed something within Swain. It was a terrible knowledge to carry, but it was also clarifying. It explains so much about the nature of Noxus, about why the Empire seemed almost to operate according to hidden purposes, why certain outcomes seemed inevitable, even when they contradicted what any rational plan would dictate. The Empire was not run by men alone. It was run by something far older and far more alien than the petty politics of human rulers. And having glimpsed this truth, Swain knew that he could not simply accept it. He could not sit in his exile and watch from a distance. He had devoted his life to Noxus, had sacrificed his family and his arm for the Empire, and he believed, with an intensity that was almost religious in nature, that Noxus deserved better than to be the puppet of an ancient darkness. He needed to understand this darkness. More than that, he needed to master it, not to destroy it. He suspected that might be impossible, but to control it, to bend it to serve the genuine interests of Noxus rather than the schemes of the Black Rose. He needed to do what no one else had ever succeeded in doing. He needed to find a way to wield the demon of secrets. In the 12th year of his exile, in the darkness beneath the immortal bastion, Jericho Swain finally achieved what he had spent so many years searching for. He found Realm. Part 4. The Bargain in the Dark. The journey to the heart of the ancient thing was not a physical journey, or rather, it was only partially won. Swain had found the passages that led downward, down past the known levels of the immortal bastion, down into caverns that predated the fortress itself. But the deeper one went, the more one travelled through geography that seemed to shift and change, through spaces that did not quite make sense when compared to the spaces above them. It was as if the deeper levels of the immortal bastion operated according to a different geometry, or perhaps according to no geometry that mortal minds were designed to comprehend. He descended alone, carrying only what was necessary for survival, and what he believed would be needed for the encounter he knew must come. He had prepared for this moment carefully. He had filled his mind with memories of power, of the brief moments of triumph he had known, of the will that had driven him to do things that no ordinary person could have done. He had spent days in contemplation, forcing his consciousness inward, teaching himself to see beyond the veil of ordinary perception. In the deepest place, far below even the ancient foundations of the immortal bastion, he found what appeared to be a chamber. The walls seemed to be carved from something that was not quite stone, something that had the appearance and density of rock, but seemed somehow to exist in more dimensions than the rock Swain was accustomed to encountering. The air in this place was thick and difficult to breathe, as if it was so old that it had begun to crystallize with age. And here, in this impossible space, he encountered the demon. It did not manifest itself in any physical form, at least not initially. Instead, it was a presence, a hunger, a consuming attention that turned towards Swain the moment he entered its domain. Swain felt the weight of that attention like a physical thing, pressing against his consciousness, seeking to penetrate the barriers of his will. This was what it had felt like at the moment of his near death in Ionia, only now magnified 1,000-fold. The entity that had reached for him across the boundary between life and death was reaching for him again, here in its own place of power. And this time, it was not weakened by distance. This time, Swain was entirely within its sphere of influence. But Swain did not panic, and he did not flee. He had spent years preparing for this moment. He had trained his will until it was as hard as iron. He had learned to see through the deceptions and illusions that his own mind could create, and these skills now served him in good stead. He reached out with his mind just as the demon reached out toward him, and he did something that perhaps no other living person would have attempted. He looked directly into the consciousness of the ancient thing. It was not a sight meant for mortal eyes or mortal minds to comprehend. It was like staring into a vast abyss, like watching the slow dissolution of everything one believed to be real and permanent. Swain perceived centuries of accumulated secrets, knowledge gathered from the dying and the dead, whispers that had been spoken in darkness and shadow throughout the entire history of Noxus and the civilizations that had come before. He perceived the entity's hunger, its endless need to feed upon the consciousness of the living, its inability to interact with the world except through the intermediary of mortal creatures like the ravens that hunted at its behest. And he perceived, perhaps most importantly, the entity's loneliness. It was ancient beyond mortal comprehension, cut off from others of its kind, imprisoned in this place by forces that it could not overcome. There was a moment, brief and crucial, when the demon perceived in Swain something that it had never encountered before. The entity had been approached by countless magicians and sorcerers over the centuries. It had been bargained with, beseeched, threatened, and cajoled, but it had never encountered anyone who approached it with the intention not of being consumed or of enslaving the demon, but of understanding it, of comprehending it, of looking directly at the truth of what it was without flinching away. In that moment of understanding, a kind of connection formed. What happened next is difficult to put into words, because it was not truly a conversation in any human sense. Instead, it was a negotiation conducted at the level of pure will, conducted without language or conventional meaning. Swain and the demon reached out to each other across the gulf of incomprehension that separated a mortal human from an ancient entity older than civilization, and they found, surprisingly, that there was something they could agree upon. The demon had been used by the Black Rose for centuries, its power channeled through LeBlanc and her agents, its accumulated secrets poured into the hands of those who sought to dominate Noxus from the shadows. But the demon had never truly been served in return. It had been imprisoned, fed upon, exploited. Yes, it had received sustenance through the arrangement, but it had been given nothing that it truly desired, nothing that addressed its fundamental nature and needs. Swain offered something different. He offered, essentially, a partnership. He would serve as an intermediary between the demon and the world above, granting it a perspective and a presence beyond the deep places where it dwelt. Through Swain, the entity could interact with the world in ways that LeBlanc's arrangement had never permitted. Through Swain, it could gather not just the secrets of the dying, but the secrets of the living. And in return, Swain would receive what he sought: power, knowledge, and the ability to perceive beyond the veil that separated ordinary consciousness from the deeper truths that governed reality. It was not a comfortable arrangement, and it was not one that could be described as purely beneficial to either party. But it was an arrangement that served both their interests, and that was sufficient to create a bond. The demon began to change Swain in that moment. The process was agonizing and exhilarating in equal measure. The entity flowed through him, mending the damage that had been done by Aurelia's blade years before. His severed arm was restored, though not entirely as it had been. The new arm bore within it the mark of its demonic origin, a visible reminder of the bargain that had been struck. It was stronger than an ordinary human arm, capable of things that no normal flesh and bone could achieve. But it was also different, marked by the touch of something other, someone ancient and alien. And his mind changed as well. He began to perceive in ways that humans were not meant to perceive. He could send his consciousness outward through the ravens that served the demon, seeing through multiple eyes simultaneously, gathering information from across the entire span of Noxus. He could perceive the whispers of secrets, the hidden thoughts and fears of those around him. He could understand patterns and connections that would have been invisible to an ordinary human consciousness. But there was a price. With all this new perception came a constant pressure at the edges of his awareness, a hunger that mirrored the demon's hunger, a desire to consume and absorb and incorporate the consciousness of others. The demon wanted to grow, wanted to feed more deeply than it ever had before, wanted to expand its reach into the living world through its new intermediary. Swain had to learn quickly and painfully how to maintain his own identity in the face of this hunger. He had to learn how to be a boundary between himself and the other, how to allow the demon to use his body and mind while still retaining his essential self. It was a precarious balance, and he knew even in those first moments that he would be walking this razor's edge for the rest of his life. But he succeeded. Because of the will that had driven him since childhood, because of the discipline that years of suffering and exile had instilled in him, Swain managed to retain his dominion over the bargain. He would serve as the demon's agent in the world above, but he would not be consumed. He would wield its power, but he would remain in control. The transformation was not complete in that first meeting. What occurred in the depths of the immortal bastion was merely the beginning of a much longer process. But when Swain emerged into daylight again, when he climbed back up through the ancient passages and returned to the world of men, he was fundamentally changed. He was no longer a broken man, a cripple cast out from the halls of power. He possessed the strength to reshape his world. Now it would be a matter of deciding how to use that strength. Part 5. The Return. For years after his emergence from the depths, Swain remained in obscurity. To the world above, he was simply a crippled exile, perhaps slightly mad from his long isolation. He lived in his modest residence, emerged occasionally to consult on matters of military strategy, but otherwise kept to himself. There was nothing to suggest that anything fundamental had changed about him. But during those years, Swain was working. He was learning to master the power that the demon had given him. He was training his new perception, teaching himself how to send his consciousness outward through the ravens and return it intact, how to filter the constant stream of secrets and whispers that flowed through his connection to the ancient entity, how to maintain his humanity in the face of something utterly inhuman. He was also gathering information and allies. Through his connection to the demon, through the ravens that could go anywhere and see everything, Swain began to comprehend the full extent of the Black Rose's influence within Noxus. He saw how deeply the rot had spread, how many of those who held positions of power were secretly serving LeBlanc's agenda. He identified the key figures, mapped out the structure of the organization, understood how the pieces moved in relation to each other. At the same time, he began to identify those within Noxus who might be turned to his purposes. There were those who, like him, had been wronged by the system, who harbored grudges against those in power. There were those who, while not explicitly opposed to the Black Rose, were pragmatic enough to recognize that an arrangement with Swain might serve their interests better than continued loyalty to the corrupted emperor. One such man was Darius, called the Hand of Noxus, a general of tremendous skill and devotion to the Noxian ideal. Darius had been one of Darkwill's most loyal servants, but he had also been frustrated by the Emperor's increasingly erratic decisions, frustrated by the way military strength was being squandered in futile searches for magical artifacts and impossible quests for immortality. When approached carefully, when presented with a vision of a stronger and more rational Noxus, Darius was willing to listen. There were others as well, officers and soldiers and men of influence who recognized that something was profoundly wrong with the government of Noxus. even if they did not fully understand what that something was. Swain spent years building his network, moving slowly and carefully, never revealing his hand too fully until the moment came when all the pieces would be in place. And then, finally, when the time was right, when all the preparations had been made and all the allies were positioned, he made his move. It happened in a single night. This was important. This was not a coup that would be measured in weeks of civil war or struggle. Rather, it was a perfectly executed strategic maneuver, a sudden shift of power that happened with almost shocking speed, as if the entire transition had been choreographed in advance. In the darkness of that night, Swain emerged from the shadows. He appeared before Boram Darkwill in the Imperial Chambers, accompanied by warriors who owed their loyalty to him rather than to the Emperor. Swain's new arm was visible, and it bore the marks of its demonic origin. His eyes held a light that had not been there before, a clarity that came from being able to perceive more than one level of reality simultaneously. Darkwill, the once powerful Emperor who had shaped Noxus through decades of will and cunning, was now a broken thing. Years of obsession with immortality, years of manipulation by agents of the Black Rose who sought to use him and then replace him, had reduced him to a shadow of what he had once been. When Swain confronted him, the Emperor found that he had no one to turn to for support. The soldiers who should have come to his aid had been turned or were positioned elsewhere by Swain's careful planning. The nobles who might have rallied to his support found themselves cut off from communication with each other. The Black Rose agents who had been serving as advisors simply disappeared into the night, retreating to gather their forces for what would come next. Darkwill tried to flee, tried to hide, tried to maintain his hold on the throne through force. But he was a mortal man, aged and weakened by his obsessions, and Swain was something more than mortal now. The confrontation lasted only moments. When it was over, the Emperor was dead, crushed by the hand of Jericho Swain in full view of the assembled soldiers and officers who had gathered to witness the transition. The throne that Darkwill had occupied was shattered, broken into pieces that lay scattered across the floor of the Imperial Chamber. This was deliberate. This was a symbolic act meant to communicate something important about what was to come. But Swain did not sit upon that broken throne. This was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. The action that distinguished him from every other ambitious general who had seized power through force in the history of Noxus. Instead, he called for a reorganization of Noxian government. He gathered together the military leaders, the nobles, and the skilled advisors who had supported his coup or were willing to accept it. And he proposed something radical. He proposed that Noxus should no longer be ruled by a single individual, that no emperor or empress would ever again hold absolute power within the empire. Instead, he proposed the creation of the Trifarics, a council of 3 leaders, each representing one of the core principles that defined Noxian strength. There would be a representative of might, embodying the military strength of the empire and ensuring that the physical force of Noxus remained strong and disciplined. There would be a representative of vision, a leader who would think strategically about the long-term interests of the empire and guide it toward the future. And there would be a representative of guile, a master of secrets and hidden knowledge, who would ensure that the Empire had access to intelligence and understanding beyond what could be gathered through conventional means. This was a brilliant political maneuver in many respects, and it served several purposes simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared to be a limitation on power, an attempt to create a government where no single individual could ever wield the kind of absolute authority that had led Darkwill to make such catastrophic decisions. It appeared to be a step toward a more rational and stable form of government. But Swain, who had spent years learning to understand the subtleties of power and the ways that authority could be wielded from behind the scenes, knew something that most people did not. He knew that the person who controlled the position of vision, who had the ability to see the future and plan for it, who possessed intelligence through the demon's servants and other sources, would inevitably hold more real power than the other two members of the triumvirate. In essence, he had created a system in which he could maintain absolute control over Noxus, while appearing to have distributed power equally among three leaders. The Triforix was established with Swain as the representative of vision. Darius, his ally, became the hand of Noxus, embodying military might. And the third position, the representative of guile, was filled by one of LeBlanc's known associates, someone who was left alive and in a position of power, but who was carefully watched and monitored through Swain's connection to the demon. The message was clear to those with eyes to see it. Swain was now in control, not through the blunt instrument of absolute rule like Darkwill had been, but through a more sophisticated system that appeared to distribute power while actually concentrating it in his hands. And in the days and weeks that followed, Swain began the work of reshaping Noxus according to his vision. Part 6. The Transformation of an Empire. The first thing Swain did was to pull back the military forces from the unwinnable campaigns that Darkwill had initiated. The invasion of Ionia was halted entirely. The forces that remained in that distant land were withdrawn, and the territories that had been conquered were abandoned. This move shocked many observers, who saw it as a retreat, as a failure of Noxian strength and will. But Swain understood what they did not. He understood that true strength was not measured by the sheer number of territories conquered or the expanse of territory held. True strength was measured by the ability to acquire resources that mattered, to maintain control over territories that were genuinely valuable, and to avoid wasting military strength on campaigns that could not be won. Having spent time in Ionia, having fought against the Ionian people and experienced their resistance, Swain recognized something that Darkwill had never understood. Ionia could not be conquered through military means alone, at least not at any reasonable cost. The land itself seemed to resist conquest. The culture and the spirit of the Ionian people were too deeply rooted to be uprooted by foreign arms. Any attempt to hold Ionia permanently would require an enormous commitment of resources and would ultimately fail anyway, leaving Noxus weaker rather than stronger. Better to redirect military efforts toward territories that could actually be held and integrated successfully into the Empire. This was pragmatism, but it was pragmatism rooted in a deeper understanding of what made an empire truly strong. Swain began to rebuild the military along more efficient lines, focusing on quality over quantity, on the ability to execute complex strategies, rather than simply overwhelming enemies with numbers. He encouraged innovation, supported military commanders who showed creativity in their tactics, and removed from positions of authority those who relied on blunt force alone. He also began to reform the government itself. The Black Rose's influence had been deep, but it had not been unchallenged. There were many within the government who were corrupt, who took bribes, who served their own interests rather than the interests of Noxus. Swain began to identify and remove these individuals. He did so carefully, never acting rashly, always ensuring that his accusations could be supported by evidence. This served multiple purposes. On one level, it genuinely improved the efficiency and integrity of the government. On another level, it sent a message that corruption would no longer be tolerated. On a third level, it consolidated power in the hands of those who were loyal to Swain, because those who remained in positions of authority after the purges were those who had proven themselves dependable. At the same time, Swain worked to reduce the influence of the Black Rose directly. He did not attempt to destroy the organization outright, which would have been impossible given its deep roots in Noxian society, but he worked to limit its influence, to keep it contained, to ensure that it could not grow beyond certain boundaries. This brought him into direct conflict with LeBlanc once again. The Pale Woman had survived the coup, as Swain had known she would. She was not one who could be easily destroyed or imprisoned, but she had been forced to retreat, forced to accept a diminished position, forced to work within constraints that she had never faced before during her centuries of existence. More than that, she had been forced to recognize that there was now someone in a position of power who possessed enough knowledge of her operations to contain them. Swain and LeBlanc never met directly during this period, but they conducted a kind of Cold War through intermediaries and through the careful positioning of resources and influence. It was a game played at the highest levels of political strategy, and it was not one that could ever be truly won by either side, because both possessed information and capabilities that made simple victory impossible. The Black Rose still had access to the secrets that the ancient demon at the heart of the immortal bastion provided, though now Swain was there to contest LeBlanc for those secrets, to interpret them, to ensure that they served his purposes rather than hers. The Black Rose still had wealth and resources accumulated over centuries, and it could still leverage those to create problems for Swain if given the opportunity. But Swain had something that LeBlanc had never been able to claim. He had a direct connection to the source of power beneath the immortal bastion. He did not need intermediaries. He did not need to negotiate with the ancient entity for access to its knowledge. The demon was his partner, even if it was a reluctant one, even if the partnership was always on the verge of becoming a conflict. Over time, a kind of understanding developed between them. Swain and LeBlanc maintained their respective positions of power, neither able to fully overcome the other, both understanding that an outright conflict would be mutually destructive. The Black Rose retreated further into shadow, but it did not disappear. Swain maintained his guard, watching carefully for any sign that the Pale Woman was moving to undermine his authority, ready to respond swiftly if she did. It was an uneasy peace, but it was a peace nonetheless. Meanwhile, Swain worked on the other aspects of his vision for Noxus. He believed, genuinely believed, in the ideals of the Empire, but he believed that those ideals had been corrupted and misapplied under Darkwill's rule. The idea that Noxus was a meritocracy, that any person regardless of their birth could rise to positions of power if they were strong enough and capable enough, was a good idea. But under Darkwill, it had become merely a slogan, a justification for those with power to maintain their dominance over those without it. Swain worked to make the meritocracy real. He opened opportunities for people from lower classes to advance. He made it clear that a slave could become a general if they possessed the capability. He rewarded merit and competence regardless of bloodline or family connections. This sounds simple in the telling, but in practice it was a radical transformation of the social order. It was also politically brilliant, because by opening up advancement to those who had previously been excluded from it, Swain created a new class of people who owed their position and their loyalty to him. These were people who had been nothing, who had been given the chance to become something, and who understood that they owed everything to the ruler who had extended that chance to them. At the same time, he was careful to retain the loyalty of the existing nobility and military elite. The people who had risen to power under the old system were not cast out or destroyed. Rather, they were integrated into the new system, given positions of respect and responsibility, assured that their strength and capabilities would be valued and rewarded. It was a careful balancing act, but Swain, who had spent his entire life learning to navigate the subtleties of power, knew how to execute it. Under Swain's rule, Noxus entered a period of stability that it hadn't known in decades. The constant warfare that had marked Darkwill's reign gave way to a more focused military strategy. The economy, which had been stressed by the expensive and futile campaigns, began to stabilize and even to grow. The government became more efficient, more responsive to the needs of the people, though it did not become significantly less authoritarian. This was still Noxus, after all. The Empire still believed in strength, in hierarchy, in the right of the strong to rule over the weak. But under Swain, this belief was channeled toward goals that actually served the Empire rather than the private obsessions of an aging emperor. And as Noxus grew stronger and more stable, Swain's own power grew more secure. The soldiers loved him because he provided them with effective leadership and compensation. The nobility accepted him because he had preserved their wealth and influence, at least for those who proved themselves capable and loyal. The common people supported him because he had opened pathways of advancement that had previously been closed to them. He had done something that very few rulers ever managed to accomplish. He had seized power through force, and he had then legitimized that power through competent governance and the creation of structures that appeared to distribute power while actually concentrating it in his hands. Part 7. The weight of the demon. But power acquired comes with costs that cannot always be measured in material terms. As Swain consolidated his rule over Noxus, as he shaped the Empire according to his vision, he was also engaged in an increasingly difficult struggle with the presence that shared his consciousness. The demon demanded payment for the power it had granted him. Not payment in the traditional sense of tribute or sacrifice, though there was something of that involved. Rather, the payment was constant and ongoing, a pressure that never lessened, a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. The entity wanted more secrets, more consciousness to consume, more access to the living world. Through Swain, it had experienced something it had never experienced before: the ability to influence events directly, to shape outcomes, to participate in the world of the living in ways that went far beyond merely feeding on the dying. And having tasted this participation, it wanted more. This expressed itself as a constant pressure at the edges of Swain's consciousness. There were moments, especially at night, or when he was exhausted from the demands of governance, when he could feel the demon pushing, trying to take control, trying to expand its influence beyond the boundaries that Swain had set for it. It was like living with a constant companion who was always just barely being held in check, always on the verge of overwhelming you if your attention wavered for even a moment. The toll that this took was not insignificant. Swain began to age faster than he should have. His new arm, which had been restored by the demon, required constant attention and effort to maintain. It was prone to acting of its own accord if Swain allowed his concentration to slip, responding to the demon's will rather than to his own conscious direction. He began to sleep poorly, troubled by dreams that were not entirely his own. In these dreams, he experienced memories and perceptions that came from the demon, visions of things that had happened centuries ago, of people long dead, of events that had no relationship to his own life. He would wake exhausted, never sure if he had truly slept, or if the demon had kept him conscious while inhabiting his dreams. There were moments when he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake in forging this partnership. He had gained power, yes, but at a cost that might ultimately prove too high to bear. He had gained the ability to perceive secrets and to influence events beyond normal human capacity, but he had also gained a constant companion that wanted nothing more than to consume him entirely. But there was no way to undo the bargain. The demon was part of him now, and he was part of the demon. To try to separate from it would likely result in his death, or something worse than death. The only option was to continue as he had begun, to maintain the difficult balance between himself and the other, to wield the power while being consumed by it simultaneously. It was during this period that Swain made a crucial decision regarding the structure of government he had created. He established the Triforix not merely as a practical arrangement for distributing power, but also as a safeguard against the possibility that the demon might overcome his will entirely. Darius and the representative of Guile, though they did not fully understand why Swain was implementing this system, were tasked with watching him carefully. If Swain ever appeared to lose control, if the demonic influence seemed to be taking over, then it would be their responsibility to act. They would be empowered to remove him from power, to contain him if necessary. This was a calculated risk. Swain was essentially putting himself under the surveillance of those close to him, creating a system in which he could be deposed if he ever failed to maintain his mastery of the demon. But he recognized that this was necessary. The demon was too dangerous, too alien, too vast in its hunger to be left unchecked by any safety mechanism. He understood in his private moments that he was playing with forces that no human should be forced to play with. He understood that his mastery of the demon was not absolute, that there were days when he wondered if he still controlled the partnership, or if the demon had begun to control him. He understood that every year that passed, every sacrifice he made, every use of the demon's power brought him closer to the point where the balance might tip irreversibly in the demon's favor. But he could see no alternative. The Empire needed him. Noxus needed strong leadership, and Swain was, by virtue of his connection to the demon, the strongest leader that the Empire could have. The moment he stepped down, the moment he admitted defeat and allowed someone else to take control, the delicate balance he had maintained would collapse. The Black Rose would move in to reclaim their influence. The military leaders who supported him would fragment into competing factions. The common people who had been given hope by his reforms would fall back under the dominion of the nobility. Noxus would return to the chaos and corruption that it had known under Darkwill's final years. And so Swain continued as he had been, bearing the weight of the demon, using its power to serve his vision of what Noxus should be, all the while knowing that he was walking a path that could only end in one of two ways. Either he would maintain his control until his death, passing on what remained of his humanity to his eventual successor, or he would fail, and the demon would be unleashed upon Noxus without anyone to moderate its hunger. Neither prospect was particularly comforting. Part 8. The Gathering Darkness. As the years of Swain's rule accumulated, as he settled more firmly into his position as the guiding voice of the Trifarics, his connection to the demon granted him knowledge that few others possessed. Through the ravens that were his eyes and ears, through the secrets that flowed to him constantly, he began to perceive shadows moving at the edge of perception, threats that seemed to loom beyond the horizon, dangers that the common people of Noxus could not yet comprehend. There were whispers of old powers stirring in distant lands. There were tales from travelers and merchants of warriors of incredible power moving through the world with no clear purpose, as if driven by compulsions that even they could not understand. There were reports of terrible battles in far regions, of entire armies destroyed by forces that seemed almost supernatural in nature. And through his connection to the demon, Swain began to understand what these whispers meant. He came to perceive that there existed, in the world beyond Noxus, entities that were similar in nature to the demon that had bonded with him. They were older than empires, older than civilizations. They were called the Darkin, beings that had once defended humanity against the void, but had subsequently become a threat that exceeded even the threat of the void itself. The Darkin had been imprisoned long ago, their power contained through the combined efforts of ancient magicians and warriors, but the seals that held them were not eternal. They were weakening slowly across centuries, and one by one, the Darkin were finding ways to break free from their prisons. They were returning to the world, and they were not returning in a benevolent mood. Swain understood that this was a threat that transcended the boundaries of any single nation. The rise of the Darkin threatened not just Noxus, but all of the civilized world. It threatened the entire balance of power that had existed since the days of the ancient kingdoms. And yet, most of the rulers of the world, most of the people in positions of power, did not understand this threat. They did not perceive it because they did not have access to the kind of knowledge that Swain possessed through his connection to the demon. This knowledge weighed on Swain heavily. It was the kind of knowledge that could drive a person to madness, the kind of knowledge that made all of the ordinary concerns of governance seemed simultaneously more important and less important. More important because the stability and strength of the Empire would be crucial if the Darkin rose to threaten the world. Less important because any kingdom, no matter how well governed, would be merely another casualty if the Darkin decided to remake the world according to their desires. And it was during this period that Swain's relationship with the demon changed in a subtle but significant way. The entity that shared his consciousness began to show signs of what might, in a human being, have been called fear. The demon did not fear Swain. It had never truly feared anything, as far as Swain could perceive, but it did fear the Darkin. In the vast store of secrets and memories that it had accumulated over its long existence, there were records of the Darkin and their power. The demon understood that the Darkin were entities that surpassed it in raw might, that they were not bound by the same limitations that bound the demon to the depths beneath the immortal bastion. And the demon understood that if the Darkin rose to dominion over the world, the careful arrangements that had been made across centuries, the partnerships and bargains and pacts that had allowed the demon to survive and even to flourish in a subordinate position, would all be swept away. The Darkin would not maintain the status quo. They would reshape everything according to their desires. In its own way, the demon began to collaborate more genuinely with Swain, not out of affection or loyalty, but out of a shared interest in preventing the catastrophe that would result from the Darkin's full return to power. The pressure that Swain felt at the edges of his consciousness did not diminish, but it took on a different character. It was less the pressure of an entity trying to dominate him, and more the pressure of a partner working alongside him, even if the partnership was one of necessity rather than choice. Through this altered relationship, Swain began to gather and consolidate knowledge about the Darkin threat. He used the ravens to gather reports from across the world, watching for signs of Darkin activity. He sent agents to investigate rumors and whispers. He even reached out carefully and quietly to other rulers and organizations that might have similar concerns. But he did not share the full scope of what he knew with his fellow members of the Trifarics or with the military leadership of Noxus. Not yet. Not until he had a better understanding of how the threat would manifest, and until he had a clearer picture of what response would be necessary. This secrecy was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because revealing the full scope of the Darkin threat without being able to propose a coherent response would simply create panic and undermine the stability of the Empire. Dangerous because it meant that Swain was once again operating alone, with knowledge that could not be shared, with the kind of isolation that had previously driven him toward the demon in the first place. There were nights when he stood alone in his chambers and wondered if he was becoming that which he had always opposed. Was he becoming another LeBlanc, keeping secrets, manipulating events from the shadows, treating the people of Noxus as pieces on a board to be moved according to his own hidden purposes? Was the demon's corruption spreading through him like a poison, making him less able to distinguish between what was necessary and what was merely convenient? These doubts did not paralyze him, but they troubled him. They added to the weight that he already carried, the weight of power and responsibility and the constant pressure of the demon at the edges of his consciousness. Part 9. The internal struggle. As time continued its relentless march, as the years of Swain's rule extended into a span that would have been considered remarkable for any individual leader, there began to emerge a pattern in his behavior that those close to him could not fail to notice. Swain seemed to be aging at a rate that was faster than natural, as if the years of strain were somehow compressing themselves into his physical form. His hair, which had been dark in his youth and middle age, turned white. His face, which had been strong and determined, began to show lines of exhaustion and pain. Even his new arm, the one restored by the demon, seemed to be showing signs of wear, as if even the supernatural restoration was not proof against the passage of time and the weight of what he carried. But what troubled those around him more than his physical deterioration was what seemed to be an increasing detachment from the ordinary concerns of governance. Swain still made decisions, still guided the empire with the same strategic brilliance that had defined his reign. But there was something different about the way he operated now. It was as if part of his consciousness was always elsewhere, focused on something beyond the scope of normal human perception. There were times when he would speak of things that made no sense to those listening. He would make references to events that had not yet occurred, as if he could perceive them in advance. He would give orders based on hunches and instincts that seemed to have no logical foundation, and then those orders would prove to be exactly correct based on information that had not been available to him at the time of giving the orders. Darius, his loyal ally and fellow member of the Trifarics, began to show signs of concern. He approached Swain one day with the kind of directness that only a man secure in his position could achieve, and he asked the question that was becoming impossible to avoid. "How much of you is still you?" Darius asked. "How much of what I see when I look at you is Jericho Swain? And how much is the thing that shares his consciousness?" Swain is silent for a long moment before responding. When he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been asked the one question he did not want to answer. "I am not entirely certain anymore," he admitted. "There are moments when I cannot distinguish between my thoughts and the thoughts of the demon. There are moments when I look at my reflection and I am not sure which face is looking back. I know that I am still myself, because I remember myself, because I experience continuity of consciousness. But I also know that I am changing, and I suspect that the change is only going to accelerate as time goes on." Darius studied his leader and friend carefully. "Do you fear that you will lose yourself entirely?" he asked. "Yes," Swain said simply. "And I also fear what will happen if I do lose myself. I fear what the demon will do if it ever gains complete control. I fear what that means for Noxus." "Then perhaps," Darius suggested carefully, "it is time to consider succession, to pass on what you have built to someone else, while you still have the strength and clarity to do so deliberately, rather than waiting until the moment when you have no choice but to step aside." It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of suggestion that a loyal advisor would naturally make. But Swain knew what Darius did not fully understand. The problem was not simply one of finding someone worthy to take his place. The The problem was that Swain was not certain that anyone else could maintain control of the demon the way he had managed to do. And if the demon were to be unleashed without a strong hand to guide it, the consequences for Noxus would be catastrophic. "I cannot simply hand over control to another," Swain said. "The thing that bonds with me is not a mere tool that can be passed from one hand to another like a sword. It is a presence, a consciousness, a will. Another person would have to develop their own relationship with it, their own way of maintaining the balance between being its host and being consumed by it. And I am not confident that anyone else in Noxus possesses the combination of strength, intelligence, and iron will that would be necessary to accomplish that." "Then what do you propose?" Darius asked. "Do you expect to continue indefinitely? Do you believe you can maintain this balance forever?" "No," Swain admitted. "I do not believe I can maintain it forever. But I believe I can maintain it as long as is necessary. I believe that I can maintain it long enough for the threats that are gathering in the world beyond Noxus to be addressed. And after that, perhaps the question of succession will be decided by forces beyond my control." Darius did not seem satisfied with this answer, but he understood that he would get no further on this line of questioning. He withdrew, leaving Swain alone with his thoughts and the presence that was no longer entirely separate from those thoughts. In the quiet moments that followed, Swain allowed himself to consider what he had denied to Darius. The truth was that he could feel the demon growing stronger within him. It was subtle, but it was constant. Every use of its power left him weaker, left it stronger. Every secret that he absorbed through the ravens, every piece of knowledge that flowed into him from the depths beneath the immortal bastion, expanded the demon's presence in his consciousness. He was like a man in a burning building, using the fire itself to accomplish his tasks, knowing that the longer he used the fire, the more the fire would consume the building, knowing that eventually the entire structure would be ash and rubble, but having no alternative, because leaving the building was not an option. There were people inside who needed to be protected, tasks that needed to be completed, work that could only be done by someone willing to stand in the flames. He knew, with a clarity that came from the demon's knowledge and his own keen mind, that his time was limited. The balance that he had maintained for decades was starting to shift, would continue to shift, would eventually reach a point where it could not be maintained any longer. But not yet. Not yet. The darkened threat was still gathering, still building, still in the early stages of its return to the world. Noxus needed him. The Empire needed a strong hand guiding it toward the moment when it would have to face this approaching darkness. He could hold on. He had to hold on. Part 10. The Paradox of Strength and Corruption. In the depths of the immortal bastion, in those places where the ancient thing dwelt, time moved differently than it did in the world above. Events that took years to unfold in the sunlit lands took mere moments in the darkness, or perhaps they took centuries. It was impossible to say. The demon that had bonded with Swain existed partially in both places simultaneously, and this created a kind of doubling effect that was difficult for any mortal mind to fully comprehend. It was in one of these places that Swain found himself in a state that might have been meditation, or might have been a dream, or might have been something else entirely. He was not fully awake, not fully asleep, suspended in a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the world of light and the realm of shadow. And in this state, he found himself in conversation with Demon, not in words, but in concepts and understandings that had the same effect as words, that conveyed meaning and intention across the gulf that separated mortal consciousness from something utterly inhuman. The Demon, in its ancient and incomprehensible way, was trying to communicate something important. It was trying to explain what it perceived, what it had gathered from the secrets that flowed through it, what it understood about the nature of the threat that gathered beyond Noxus. The Darkin, the Demon understood, were not simply monsters or villains. They were not evil in any simple sense. They were warriors, soldiers, defenders of a cause that had once seemed just and good. They had been created to stand against the void, to be the champions of humanity when humanity could not defend itself. They had been shaped for war, tempered in battle, given power beyond measure. And then, when their usefulness was no longer needed, when the immediate threat had been contained, they had been imprisoned. Not killed, not allowed to live in peace, but imprisoned, locked away, denied the very purpose that they had been created to fulfill. Is it any wonder, the Demon tried to communicate, that they raged against this imprisonment? Is it any wonder that when they found ways to break free, they did so with fury and vengeance in their hearts? What had been done to them was not justice. It was cruelty. And yet, Swain also understood that whether or not the Darkin's rage was justified was beside the point. Whether or not their imprisonment had been unfair, whether or not their desire for vengeance was understandable, the fact remained that if they were unleashed upon the world, they would destroy civilization as it now existed. They would reshape everything according to their desires, and the human kingdoms and empires that had been built through centuries of effort would be reduced to dust. So what was to be done? This was the question that haunted Swain, the question that he grappled with in his waking hours and in these strange meditative states that occurred between sleep and consciousness. How could one protect humanity and civilization from a threat that was, in many ways, justified in its grievance? How could one be the enemy of the Darkin without also becoming, in a very real sense, unjust? The Demon did not have an answer, or perhaps it had many answers, but they were all answers that could not be communicated through words or even through concepts. They were answers that existed in the realm of feeling and sensation, in the direct experience of being both human and inhuman, of being both the defender and the threat. In his formal chambers, in the light of day, Swain continued to make decisions and issue orders and guide the Empire. But in these strange liminal spaces between waking and sleeping, between being himself and being the Demon, he wrestled with the fundamental paradox of his existence. He had gained power to protect Noxus and to preserve civilization. But the power he had gained was itself a kind of corruption, a darkness that infected everything he touched, and the choices he made, the things he did in service of protecting the Empire and the world, were themselves acts of violence and injustice, even if they were necessary violence and necessary injustice. There was a philosophy that emerged from Swain's reign, a way of thinking about power and strength and the nature of what it meant to lead. It was not a philosophy that was formally taught or written down. but it was expressed through the way Swain governed, through the decisions he made, through the kind of leader he had become. The philosophy could be summarized in a phrase that became popular in certain circles in Noxus: strength through sacrifice, power through will, victory through the willingness to do what must be done, regardless of the cost to oneself or to others. It was a dangerous philosophy, one that could easily be corrupted and twisted into justification for the most brutal and unjust actions. And yet, it was also a philosophy that reflected something true about the nature of power and leadership in a world that was always on the edge of chaos. Swain understood that he was becoming a symbol of this philosophy, that his life and his choices were beginning to represent something larger than himself. And he understood that this was perhaps not entirely a good thing. But he could see no way to resist it, no way to step aside, no way to become something other than what he had become. He was Jericho Swain, the Grand General of Noxus, the visionary who had reshaped an empire. And he was the host of an ancient demon, the wielder of power that transcended normal human capacity, the guardian of secrets that would drive most minds into madness. He was the paradox made flesh, the contradiction that somehow functioned as a man and as a leader, even though no such thing should have been possible. Part 11. The passing years' time continued its inexorable march. The decades accumulated into something that could no longer be measured in the traditional way. Swain had been ruling Noxus for so long that there were people living in the empire who had been born after he seized power, who had no memory of any other leader, who believed that the way things were under Swain's rule was the natural and proper order of things. The empire itself was transformed. What had been a collection of competing military strongmen and fractious nobles had become a unified force, a nation that operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The common people lived better lives than they had under Darkwill, at least on average. The military was strong and disciplined. The government functioned with a level of efficiency that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. And yet, there was a price for all of this. There was the price that Swain himself paid, day after day, as the demon continued to grow stronger within him, as the balance between his will and its hunger became increasingly precarious. There was also the price that the Empire paid, the price of living under the rule of a leader who was only partially human, who made decisions based on knowledge and perceptions that ordinary people could not understand. The Black Rose had, after many years, come to a kind of understanding with Swain. They did not work together exactly, but they had learned to coexist, to pursue their own goals, while being careful not to cross Swain's red lines. LeBlanc herself was even more ancient and difficult to perceive than she had been in earlier days, but her presence was felt in the political currents that moved through Noxus. There were moments when Swain wondered if LeBlanc understood what was happening to him, if she perceived through her own mysterious means that he was being consumed from within by the power he wielded. There were moments when he wondered if she was simply waiting, watching, biding her time until the moment when the demon would overcome Swain's will entirely, at which point she would move to either control the resulting chaos or take advantage of it for her own purposes. But there was no way to know for certain, and worrying about it would have accomplished nothing. So Swain continued as he had always continued, doing what needed to be done, making decisions based on the knowledge he possessed, guiding the Empire as well as he could toward the future he envisioned. And through all of this, the ravens continued to fly. They carried Swain's consciousness across the Empire and beyond, gathering secrets, observing events, bringing back knowledge of what was happening in the wider world. It was through the ravens that he learned of other threats besides the Darkin, of other powers that were stirring, of other dangers that seemed to gather at the edges of the known world. There was also, throughout this period, a kind of quiet that hung over Swain's personal life, a loneliness that seemed to deepen rather than diminish as time went on. He had sacrificed much to achieve power, and now he was sacrificing much more to maintain it. There was no room in his life for the kinds of personal connections that most humans sought. There was no room for love or family or genuine friendship, because any such connection would have been a liability, a weakness that his enemies could exploit. And so he was alone, even in the midst of a court full of people, even in the midst of an empire of millions who depended on his leadership. He was alone in the way that only the most powerful ever are, the way that gods are alone, isolated at the top by the very fact of their supremacy. There was a kind of tragic beauty to it, if one was inclined to see it that way, and Swain was, in his darker moments, inclined to see it that way. He saw himself as a necessary sacrifice, someone who had given up everything that made life worth living in order to preserve the life and the freedom of others. But he also knew that this narrative was, in many ways, a lie. He was not purely a sacrifice. He had chosen this path, and having chosen it, he had reaped the benefits of power that came with it. He had not given up everything out of pure altruism. He had done it because he believed it was right, yes, but also because it served his own purposes, because it brought him power and knowledge and the ability to shape events. The truth was more complicated than either the narrative of sacrifice or the narrative of ambition alone could capture. The truth was that Swain was both at the same time, that his motivations were mixed and complicated, that he was simultaneously serving the Empire and serving himself, simultaneously corrupted by power and heroically resistant to that corruption. And this complexity, this refusal to be simply one thing or another, was perhaps his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It was what allowed him to maintain the precarious balance with the demon, but it was also what made that balance increasingly difficult to maintain. A simpler man, a man of pure ambition or pure idealism, might have either succumbed to the demon long ago or successfully thrown it off entirely. But Swain was neither simple nor pure, and so he continued to exist in this state of contradictory tension, always on the verge of falling one way or the other, never quite giving in, never quite overcoming. Part 12. The Eternal Vigil. In the final years of his life, though Swain did not know that they were the final years, he found himself increasingly withdrawn from the day-to-day governance of Noxus. The Trifrics had evolved into a system that could function without his constant oversight. Darius and the representative of Guile handled most of the practical matters of running the Empire. Swain's role had become more and more that of a seer, a visionary who emerged from seclusion only to offer guidance on matters of great strategic importance. This was partly by design and partly by necessity. By design, because Swain had always intended for the system of government he created to be able to function without any single individual, and because he understood that his continued presence in day-to-day governance was increasingly detrimental rather than beneficial, as his connection to the demon became more pronounced, but also by necessity, because Swain's capacity for normal human activity was diminishing. Longer and longer periods of time were being spent in those liminal states between waking and sleeping, between being himself and being the demon. His body was aging at a rate that seemed to accelerate with each passing year. The demonic arm that had been restored to him decades ago was beginning to show signs of instability, as if even the supernatural restoration could not indefinitely resist the simple fact of entropy and the passage of time. And yet, in these withdrawn years, Swain seemed to find a kind of peace that had eluded him in earlier decades. There was no more need to maintain the careful facade of being a human ruler, operating according to human rules and human reasoning. He could allow himself to be what he had become, could embrace the merger between himself and the demon that had seemed so terrible and threatening in earlier years, could stop fighting against it and instead work with it. It was during this period that those close to him noticed a change in the way he spoke about the future of Noxus. He seemed to have given up any notion that he would be able to shape the empire forever, that his influence would continue indefinitely. Instead, he spoke of the future as if it was something that was approaching inevitably, as if there were great changes coming that would transform everything that he had built. When asked what these changes would be, he would not say directly, but there were hints in his words, suggestions that he perceived the approach of the Darkin, that he understood this would be a test that Noxus would have to face, that the Empire would either rise to the challenge and become something greater than it had been, or would fall. He also, in these final years, seemed to develop a kind of reconciliation with LeBlanc. Not a friendship exactly, but a kind of mutual understanding. She visited him once in his chambers high in the Immortal Bastion, and they spoke for hours. What they said to each other was known only to them, but afterward, both of them seemed to have reached some kind of accommodation, some kind of agreement about how they would move forward in the time that remained. It was also during this period that Swain began the work of committing his knowledge to writing, not in the form of any official historical record, but in private journals and correspondence addressed to future leaders of Noxus. He recorded what he had learned about the demon, about the Darkin, about the forces that moved in the shadows of the world. He recorded his observations about the nature of power and leadership, about the ways that strength could be corrupted, about the price that those who wielded great power were forced to pay. These writings were not meant for public consumption. Rather, they were meant to serve as guides for whoever would come after him, whoever would inherit the position that he had held for so long. He understood that no one could directly inherit his connection to the demon, that the bargain he had struck with that ancient entity was personal to him in a way that could not be transferred. But he believed that his insights into how to deal with such matters, how to navigate the treacherous waters of power without being entirely consumed by them, might prove valuable to future generations. As his physical body grew weaker, as the years accumulated more heavily upon him, Swain seemed to exist increasingly in those other places, those spaces where the boundary between the human world and the demon's realm became blurred. He would spend days at a time in apparent sleep, though those who tended to him understood that he was not truly sleeping, that something else was occurring in those moments. And in these deeper places, in these conversations between Swain and the entity that shared his consciousness, there seemed to be a gradual shift in their relationship. The demon, which had for so long been a presence that threatened to consume him, began to take on a different character. It was as if, over the decades of coexistence, the two had learned to understand each other in a deeper way, had moved from a relationship of struggle and resistance to something more complex and more intimate. The demon began to defer to Swain's will in ways that it had never done before, not out of weakness, but out of something that might almost be called respect. And Swain, in turn, began to allow the demon a kind of freedom that he had always denied it before, allowing it to express its nature more fully, to gather secrets and consume consciousness in ways that Swain would not have permitted in earlier years. It was as if they had become, in some strange and incomprehensible way, partners in a deeper sense than they had ever been. Two very different beings, one mortal and one ancient and alien, learning to move together, learning to exist in a state of genuine cooperation rather than struggle. In the final months of his life, and Swain spent almost all of his time in seclusion. He saw almost no one except for Darius, who came to visit him regularly, and a few trusted servants who saw to his physical needs. He communicated little, spoke rarely, seemed to be waiting for something that the rest of the world could not perceive. And then, one day, he simply closed his eyes and did not open them again. Epilogue. The Raven's Rest. When Jericho Swain died, there was no fanfare, no grand funeral ceremony. This was by his own instruction, written in one of the many letters he left behind. The Empire continued to function, the Trifarics continued to govern, and most of the people of Noxus were scarcely aware that their Grand General had passed from the living world. But those who had known him, those who had served under him or worked alongside him, understood that something fundamental had changed. The presence that had seemed to hang over Noxus, the sense of watchful intelligence that seemed to monitor everything that occurred within the Empire, that sense gradually faded. Whether the demon went with him, whether it was released when Swain died, whether it continued to exist in some form after his passing, no one could say with certainty. The ravens ceased their constant circling. The whispers of secrets that had seemed to flow through the corridors of the immortal bastion grew fainter and fainter until they ceased entirely. In the days following his death, as the news gradually spread through Noxus and beyond, there were many assessments made of what Swain's life and rule had meant. Some saw him as a great leader who had lifted the Empire from chaos into stability and strength. Others saw him as a tyrant who had ruled through fear and demonic power, who had corrupted the ideals of Noxian strength through his dark bargains. The truth, as is often the case with complex figures who live long lives and make consequential decisions, was probably somewhere in between. Swain had been both great and terrible, both heroic and corrupted, both serving the Empire and serving himself. He had made choices that saved lives and made choices that cost lives. He had built structures that endured, and he had built structures that would eventually crumble. In the years after his death, as new generations took power and new challenges arose, the legacy of Jericho Swain would be debated, analyzed, reinterpreted. Some would lionize him as a visionary who had prevented catastrophe and preserved civilization. Others would condemn him as a corrupted tyrant who had compromised the ideals of the empire for his own power. But in those first quiet days after his death, in the chambers of the immortal bastion, where he had spent so much of his life, there was a kind of peace. The balance that he had maintained so carefully for so many decades had finally been released. The tension that had animated his existence resolved at last. And in the depth beneath the immortal bastion, in those places where the ancient demon dwelt, there was silence. Whether that silence was permanent or merely temporary, whether the entity that had bonded with Swain would someday find another host, whether it would continue to influence events from the shadows as it had for centuries, no one could know for certain. The story of Jericho Swain was, in that moment of his death, complete. The man who had sacrificed everything for his empire, who had sold his soul to a demon in order to preserve civilization, who had wielded power that transcended human capacity, who had become something more than human and less than human simultaneously, had finally come to rest. The ravens, released from their burden of carrying his consciousness across the world, departed into the sky, and Noxus, forever changed by the decades of his rule, continued on into an uncertain future. A closing for the sleepy summoner. Thank you for staying with this story until the end, sleepy summoner. Thank you for walking through the darkness of Noxus alongside Jericho Swain, for witnessing his rise from privilege to exile to power, for understanding, in some small measure, what it meant for one man to bear such a burden. This was a story about power and the price it demands. It was a story about the ways that ambition and idealism can become indistinguishable from each other. It was a story about sacrifice, and about the question of whether sacrifice made in service to others is truly selfless, or whether it is merely another form of ambition. It was also a story about identity, about what it means to remain yourself when something other is trying to consume you, about the struggle to maintain humanity in the face of forces that would transform you into something else entirely. Jericho Swain did not win. He did not achieve lasting victory or permanent peace. The darkened threat that he perceived would, in time, arrive to test Noxus as he knew it would. The demon that he tried to control would, perhaps, find other hosts and other expressions of its will. The structures he built would eventually change and evolve and perhaps collapse. But what he did was important. What he chose to do, the sacrifices he made, the path he walked, these things matter. They mattered to the people who lived under his rule. They mattered to the empire that he shaped, and they matter in some indefinable way to the larger story of Runeterra, to the great struggles between light and darkness that define the world. Let this story be a lullaby to you, sleepy summoner. Let Swain's journey be a meditation on strength and weakness, on power and powerlessness, on the ways that those who seek to change the world are inevitably changed by their efforts. Let it be a reminder that all things, no matter how powerful they seem, are temporary, that all stories eventually end, that even the greatest leaders and the strongest empires eventually pass into memory. Sleep well, knowing that such people exist in the world, such choices are made, such struggles are undertaken. Sleep well, knowing that there are those who bear burdens that are almost too heavy for any being to carry, who sacrifice themselves for the good of others, who wield power not for their own glory, but in service to something greater. And if you wake in the night and hear the distant cry of ravens, if you see shadows in the corners of your vision, if you sense secrets whispered in the darkness, remember that these might be the echoes of Jericho Swain's presence, still watching, still waiting, still serving the empire he loved even in death. May you rest well, sleepy summoner. May your dreams be peaceful. May you find, in the face of your own challenges and your own choices, the strength that Jericho Swain found, even if it comes at a cost that you must be willing to pay. The story is ended. The raven has come home to rest, and the darkness of Noxus continues on, eternal and patient, waiting for whatever comes next. Sleep now, and let the night carry you away from this tale and into dreams of your own.